Imagine being like 7 years old, just a kid, right?
Yeah.
And you are starving on a dirt floor. And the entire adult world around you looks at you and basically agrees, you are fundamentally broken
Wow.
and you will never make it. What does a developing human brain do with that kind of information?
I mean, it doesn't question it. It can't.
Exactly. It just accepts it as a law of physics.
Yeah.
And the thing is, we all carry these invisible scripts that were handed to us by other people.
Oh, totally. We all do.
But we rarely stop to consider, like, the devastating mechanics of how those scripts get written in the first place. Or, more importantly, how we can actually tear them up.
Yeah, because the human mind is essentially just this meaning-making machine.
Right, right.
So when a child is presented with a consistent narrative from their environment, they lack the cognitive architecture to reject it.
They just absorb it.
Exactly. They don't have the capacity to step back and say, well, these adults are just projecting their own systemic trauma and hopelessness onto me.
Which would be ridiculous to expect from a 7-year-old.
Right. Instead, the child just internalizes the consensus. And that narrative, it solidifies into their actual identity.
It becomes who they are.
Yeah. And what we are examining today is like the anatomy of that exact process and the specific psychological tools required to dismantle it.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the source material we have for this deep dive is just an absolute goldmine.
It really is.
We are looking at a highly detailed, incredibly emotionally charged draft manuscript for a keynote speech. The title is The Power of a Better Story, and the context here is just so crucial. It is custom tailored for Douglas Cherokee Head Start teachers in Tennessee.
Okay, so we are talking about educators from 8 rural counties gathering in Morristown.
Exactly. These are people dealing with severe burnout, federal budget uncertainty, frustrated parents, and kids who are dealing with a lot of trauma.
Which is why the speaker's approach in this manuscript is so masterful.
It's brilliant.
Because if you walk into a room full of exhausted, under-resourced educators,
Right.
and you deliver a generic toxic positivity seminar, telling them to just change their mindset,
You will lose them instantly.
instantly, they will cross their arms, roll their eyes, and tune you completely out.
Because they're in the trenches.
Right. But the speaker bypasses those natural, completely justified defenses by using his own extreme life story as like a Trojan horse.
He sneaks it right in.
Yeah, he disguises this really profound, sophisticated cognitive behavioral framework as a riveting personal narrative.
And the meta level of this manuscript is what makes it so fascinating to read. We have his internal notes and stage directions written in the margins.
Which you never get to see.
Never. We see the exact pacing he plans to use. At one point, he literally writes to himself, wait, let me find it. Here. Hold silence. Do not rescue the room from the silence.
Wow, that is powerful.
Isn't it? He is deliberately engineering an environment that forces the audience to confront the heavy, uncomfortable weight of their own internal narratives.
He's not letting them off the hook.
Exactly. And for you listening right now, whether you are managing a corporate team or navigating a career transition or just feeling deeply stuck in your own head,
Which happens to all of us.
the architecture of story breaking that we are about to explore applies directly to your life.
Because the mechanics of belief,
Yeah.
they don't change based on your profession. The origin story the speaker shares begins in a tiny, forgotten village in the deep south of Haiti.
And he strips away any romanticism immediately, right?
Oh, completely. He describes a place with no running water, no electricity, no medical care.
Just extreme deprivation.
Yeah, but he makes it clear that the physical deprivation is secondary to the emotional abandonment that he establishes right out of the gate.
Right, because his mother leaves him.
Yes, when he was just 9 months old.
Yeah.
But he makes a really careful distinction here. He says she didn't leave because she didn't love him.
She left out of desperation.
Absolute desperation. Heading to the capital, Port-au-Prince, to try and somehow break the cycle of poverty.
So she leaves him with a neighbor. And the speaker notes that his survival was essentially just a transactional afterthought for this neighbor.
It was conditional.
Entirely. The neighbor only kept this baby in the hope that the mother might occasionally send back, like, a bar of soap or a little flour or sugar.
Wow.
Yeah, and if the supplies stopped, his perceived value dropped to 0. He paints this visceral picture of his daily existence.
The physical toll on a child's body in that environment is just, it's hard to hear.
It is. He talks about contracting diseases that swelled his stomach, crawling across the dirt floor in the pitch black, just crying out, "Mama!" until his vocal cords literally gave out.
And then just curling up in the dirt.
Yeah.
He uses a very specific detail about his food that really highlights the relentless hostility of his environment.
Oh, the breadfruit.
Yes. He
Ah.
mentions eating breadfruit for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And he describes it to the audience as a potato that fights back.
I thought that was such a clever line.
It is. It's a great use of humor to cut the tension in the room, but it also serves a psychological purpose.
How so?
Well, it illustrates that in his world, even the fundamental act of receiving nourishment required a physical struggle. Every element of his environment was adversarial.
Everything was fighting him.
Exactly. The flies, the mosquitoes, the tropical winds that were so strong, he had to run and wrap his frail arms around a tree trunk just to keep from being blown away.
That imagery is just, it really sets the stage for what I think is the most devastating moment in his childhood.
The naming.
The naming. So the village adults are watching this toddler. They see the swollen stomach, the frailty, the constant sickness, and they decide to give him a label.
They name him Coco Bay.
Coco Bay.
Yeah.
Which in Creole translates to crippled.
It's just brutal.
They look at a struggling child and they casually predict right to his face that he will never live to see adulthood. They declare him a lost cause.
And the speaker writes in his notes, underlining it for emphasis, right?
Yes. He writes, "And here is the part I want you to hear. I believed them."
I mean, that phrase right there unlocks the entire concept of this deep dive.
Because, of course, he believed them.
Exactly. Evolutionary psychology explains why. I mean, for early humans, surviving meant staying within the tribe.
Right. If you get kicked out, you die.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exile meant death. So our brains are hardwired to adopt the beliefs of our surrounding community as a survival mechanism.
Even if the belief is about ourselves.
Especially then. When an entire village looks at a child and says, "You are Coco Bay," the child's brain registers that label not as an insult, but as a crucial piece of environmental data.
Like, this is a fact about the world I live in.
Yes.
It makes me wonder how many invisible name tags we are all wearing right now.
Oh, a ton of them.
Think about the labels handed to us in childhood by teachers or parents or peers, like, "You're the lazy one.
Or "You're not a math person."
You're too loud. You're not college material." We take these labels, these invisible name tags, and we just slap them on our chests.
We wear them every day.
We internalize them so completely that they become our default operating system. And we forget that someone else actually wrote the tag.
The real tragedy of the village wasn't just the cruelty of the name Coco Bay. It was that Coco Bay became his inner monologue.
It was the voice in his head.
Every time he woke up hungry, the voice in his head said, "This is happening because I am Coco Bay." And the speaker uses this to draw a brilliant razor-sharp distinction between a condition and a story.
Okay, break that down for me.
So the physical realities of his life,
Yeah.
the parasites, the dirt floor, the lack of plumbing, those were factual conditions.
Okay, facts.
Right. But Coco Bay, this conclusion that he was inherently worthless and doomed, that was a story.
I want to push back on that slightly on behalf of the listener because, the line between condition and story gets incredibly blurry when you are in the thick of suffering.
It does. It feels like one and the same.
When I read this, my immediate reaction was, but wait, the story is true. He was crippled by disease. He was starving. How can he call it a fictional story when the physical evidence is literally staring him in the face? It feels almost like he's gaslighting himself.
That is the exact tension the speaker wants the audience to feel. We have to look at how a conclusion is drawn. Think of it like a mathematical equation or like a syllogism in logic.
Okay.
Fact A, I am currently starving. Fact B, I have a disease. Those are indisputable conditions.
Can't argue with those.
Right. But the conclusion he drew, therefore, I am worthless and my future will never be anything but suffering, that is completely fabricated.
Ah, I see.
It is a narrative layered over the facts. A condition is a temporary state of being, but a story is a permanent declaration of identity.
And the danger is when we stitch them together.
Exactly. The danger comes when we stitch the two together so tightly that we can't tell where the circumstance ends and our identity begins.
So the condition is the what, and the story is the what this means about me forever.
Yes, perfectly said.
Which explains why simply changing the condition doesn't automatically fix the life. If you run away from the village but take the invisible name tag with you,
Nothing really changes.
Nothing changes. And we see this play out perfectly in the manuscript when he details his experience with what psychologists call the geographic cure.
The geographic cure is such a common behavioral loop. It's this belief that our internal misery is entirely the fault of our external geography.
If I just move, I'll be happy.
Right. If I just switch departments at work, or if I just move to a new city, or end this relationship and start a new one, all my problems will magically vanish.
We try to solve an internal narrative problem with an external logistical solution.
And it never works.
So at 7 years old, his mother finally scrapes together 50 cents to send for him. He gets on this battered, crowded truck named Voici Fene, which means, here's Fene, and he heads for the capital, Port-au-Prince.
Leaving the village behind.
Yeah, and he mentions he didn't even wave goodbye out of sadness. He waved out of relief. He thought moving to the big city was going to be an instant paradise.
He thought the geographic cure would save him.
He really did.
But the reality of Port-au-Prince was just a different flavor of devastation.
It wasn't paradise at all.
Not at all. And the speaker specifically curates the details here to show the failure of that geographic cure. He describes arriving at a literal shack with dirt floors.
So still on a dirt floor.
Yes. He sleeps on the ground with his siblings, waking up to the terrifying sensation of rats nibbling on his toes.
That detail is haunting.
It is. And psychologically, the suffering actually intensifies because of the proximity to wealth.
Right, because in the village, everyone was starving. It was a shared baseline.
Everyone was in the same boat.
But in the concrete jungle of the city, he smells food he can't eat. He sees children playing with toys he will never touch.
The isolation of poverty is so magnified when you are pressed right up against the glass of someone else's prosperity.
It's like staring into a world you aren't allowed to enter.
Exactly. So he hits absolute rock bottom. The hunger is worse. The environment is terrifying. And what is the narrative running in his head?
The exact same one from the village.
Exactly. I am Kokobe. I am worthless. This is all there will ever be.
The zip code changed, but the operating system remained perfectly intact.
When you change your geography without changing your psychology, you just unpack your old problems in a new room.
That's a great way to put it.
So he walks out of that rat-infested shack, sobbing, totally overwhelmed by the finality of his situation. He wanders the neighborhood and ends up sitting with an elderly woman named Tati Da.
And Tati Da is a crucial pivot point in this framework.
She changes everything.
She does. And keep in mind, she is just as poor as his mother. She lives in a shack, she has no money, she has no systemic power.
Right, she's not a fairy godmother with a magic wand.
No.
Yeah.
So he sits down with her and starts unloading his misery. He talks about the hunger, the rats, the hopelessness.
He's venting.
He is. And he expects her to validate his story. He expects her to say, life is terribly unfair to us, we are doomed. He wants company in his misery. What's fascinating here is how Tati Da responds. She delivers what is essentially a masterclass in cognitive reframing.
She really does.
She doesn't deny his reality, because to tell a starving 7-year-old to just look on the bright side would be incredibly toxic.
Right, it would completely invalidate his very real physical pain.
Exactly. But she fiercely refuses to validate the conclusion he has drawn from that pain.
The stage directions note that the speaker physically mimics her actions on stage, right?
Yes, he acts it out. He shows how she grabbed his hands, leaned in close, gave him this piercing look, and delivered the intervention. She says, you need a better story.
Wow.
And then she breaks down the difference between condition and identity for him. She says, hunger comes, hunger goes, hard times come, hard times go. But who you are inside, that never leaves you.
She essentially takes a scalpel and severs the neurological link he had forged between his current suffering and his future potential.
She cuts the tie.
Yes. She acknowledges the temporary condition, the hunger,
Yeah.
but protects his permanent identity. And then she does something extraordinary.
She gives him a new vision.
She projects a new narrative into the void. She tells this crying, starving boy that one day he will travel, he will make a name for himself, and strangers from faraway places will be inspired by his life.
She writes him a completely new name tag right there in the dirt.
It's beautiful.
And the speaker turns this moment into the foundational pillar of his framework for the teachers. He calls it the story breaker.
The story breaker.
He tells the audience, Tati Da didn't give me a single piece of bread that day. She didn't fix my plumbing. She changed the story I was telling myself about my circumstances, and that changed everything.
And this leads to the ultimate question he poses to the room, right?
Yes. He asks, is the story you are rehearsing true, or is it fiction?
This is where the keynote stops being a speech and becomes like an interactive psychological exercise.
He really puts them to work.
He challenges these burned-out educators to isolate the exact narrative they rehearse on their commute home, or the story that keeps them awake on Sunday night, dreading Monday morning.
The Sunday Scaries narrative.
Exactly. He asks them to weigh that narrative against Tatida's standard. Is the story true, or is it a fictional conclusion you've drawn from a temporary condition?
And the pacing he dictates in the manuscript here is just wild. He writes, long pause. Do not rescue the room from the silence. 30 seconds minimum.
30 seconds.
30 seconds of dead silence on a stage with hundreds of people staring at you. That is an eternity.
It's agonizing.
But he forces them to sit in the quiet and actually feel the weight of their own fictional narratives.
Yeah.
He makes them confront the Coca Bay labels they've placed on their own careers and lives.
I can't escape it.
No. And then he makes them turn to each other and say out loud, the story I have been telling myself is a lie.
He has them say it multiple times, right?
Yeah.
Increasing their volume.
Yeah, getting louder and louder.
See, this isn't just a theatrical trick. It serves a really specific neurological function.
Really? How so?
Well, vocalizing the realization out loud begins the process of disrupting the established neural pathway. It forces the brain to process the thought through the motor cortex and the auditory system.
So, makes it physical.
Exactly. It makes the abstract realization of physical reality. Once the lie is exposed, nature abhors a vacuum. You cannot just remove a foundational belief without replacing it.
You have to install a new operating system.
Right.
Which brings up the core mechanism of how stories dictate reality. If you rehearse a story, you relive it. Your story doesn't just describe the world around you, it actively creates the world around you.
To understand how this works, we need to look at neuroplasticity, specifically a concept known as Hebb's law.
Okay, what is Hebb's law?
It states that neurons that fire together wire together.
Okay.
Imagine walking through a dense forest. The first time you push through the brush, it's difficult, it's overgrown.
You're getting scratched up.
Right. But if you walk that exact same path every single day, eventually you clear a trail. Over time, that trail becomes a paved road, and then a superhighway.
So it gets easier and easier to travel.
Exactly. The brain operates the exact same way. Every time you rehearse a thought of defeat or exhaustion, you widen that neural superhighway. The brain becomes incredibly efficient at processing defeat.
Let me see if I can translate that to the listener's daily life. It's like having a bouncer at the door of your conscious mind, right?
Yeah.
The reticular activating system.
Yes, the RAS.
If your internal narrative, your rehearsed story is, my job is terrible and everyone is out to get me, you have basically handed the bouncer a VIP list that only includes negative interactions.
Precisely. The reticular activating system filters the millions of bits of sensory data you encounter every second. It only lets in information that proves your current story true.
So it's looking for proof.
Always. If your story is my job is terrible, the bouncer blocks the compliment your coworker gave you or the moment of quiet focus you had in the morning.
They aren't on the list.
Nope. Access denied. It only lets in the passive-aggressive email or the jammed copier. Your brain actively curates your reality to match the script you handed it.
And the speaker knows exactly what scripts these Head Start teachers are rehearsing. He names the lies out loud to the room.
What does he say?
He says, I know the stories you are telling yourselves. I am too tired. I am not making a difference. I should have quit last year. I am just one person in one classroom, and none of this systemic dysfunction is ever going to change.
That last one is heavy.
It is, and he specifically flags that last one in his notes as the ultimate morale killer.
He confronts them with the brutal truth. Those stories are fictional conclusions based on factual exhaustion.
The exhaustion is real, but the conclusion is a lie.
Right. Every time a teacher sighs and says, I am too tired to make a difference, their brain receives the command, agrees with the assessment, and physically delivers more fatigue to match the story.
Wait, really? It delivers more fatigue?
Yes. They are not merely observing their burnout, they are actively authorizing it.
Wow. To illustrate how to break this loop, he tells a deeply funny but poignant story about his mother that perfectly contrasts with that Tatida intervention.
Oh, this is a great story.
So, fast forward a couple of decades. He has immigrated to the United States, survived incredible odds, and is beginning his career as a professional speaker.
He's made it out.
He made it out.
Huh.
He is traveling around, getting on stages, and telling audiences about the dirt floor, the swollen stomach, and the rats nibbling his feet.
And his mother's reaction to this new career is incredibly telling.
She's not thrilled.
Not at all. She calls him absolutely horrified.
Mm.
She demands to know why he's telling a bunch of strangers their family business.
She wants to keep it quiet.
Yeah, she begs him to sanitize the story. She says, "Can't you just tell them you're from Haiti and leave the rats out of it?"
She is reacting from a place of deep protective shame. She wants to hide the messy, painful reality of the Cocoa Bay years.
She wants to present a clean, acceptable version of their lives.
But then, the tangible proof of his new story arrives in the mail. He does a corporate speaking gig for AT&T, and 2 weeks later, an actual check shows up.
The proof.
The proof. He leaves it sealed on the counter until his mother is in the room. He opens it, pulls out the check, and holds it up so she can clearly see the comma and the zeros.
I love this part.
He describes her looking at the check, looking up at him, looking back down at the check, and then she says, "Son, why don't you tell more stories?"
It's a wonderful moment of levity, but the underlying psychological contrast is massive.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You have two women, Tatida and his mother, separated by decades, dealing with the exact same narrative.
Right.
Tatida represents holding the vision before any proof exists. She looked at a starving boy and spoke a reality into existence that had zero empirical evidence.
Not at all.
His mother, on the other hand, represents needing the proof before believing the vision. She needed to physically hold the AT&T check before she could validate the story.
And this is the crux of human limitation. Most of us operate exactly like the mother.
We want the guarantee.
Yes. We demand evidence from the universe before we are willing to change our internal narrative. We say, "I'll believe I'm successful when I get the promotion."
I'll believe I'm worthy of love when someone commits to me.
Exactly. I'll stop rehearsing the story of burnout when they fix the school budget.
But the paradox is, if you wait for the physical evidence to change before you change your story, you will be waiting forever.
Forever.
Because your current story is the engine generating your current evidence. It's a completely closed loop. You have to speak life into the void. You have to rehearse the reality you want before you have the AT&T check in your hand.
And the speaker challenges the educators with this exact dynamic. He reminds them of their true function.
What does he tell them?
He says, on paper, you teach the alphabet, you manage behavior, you fill out endless compliance forms. But fundamentally, you are professional vision holders.
You are Tatida.
Yes, you are Tatida. The children walking into their classrooms are carrying the weight of generational poverty, systemic neglect, and Cocoa Bay name tags.
Heavy stuff.
The teacher's job is to look at a 4-year-old and speak life into a future that the child's current environment completely contradicts.
He tells them that a child might take that new story home to a deeply broken environment, carry it for 35 years, and eventually stand on a stage because one teacher refused to validate a lie.
The emotional gravity of that responsibility is just staggering.
It really is. But the speaker is a realist. He doesn't let the audience float away on a cloud of inspiration. He knows that adopting a new story is only half the battle.
The second you try to change your narrative, the world will test it.
Oh, immediately.
Mm.
Which brings us to the phase of the framework dedicated to defending the narrative.
Right, because a new, empowering story is incredibly fragile in its infancy.
Yeah.
It disrupts the established order.
So the speaker introduces a concept he calls the Jonathan archetype to illustrate this universal resistance.
Okay, tell us about Jonathan.
So after he moved to the U.S., he gets a job as a doorman at a hotel carrying heavy bags for guests. He is operating on the fumes of Tatida's promise. He is rehearsing his new story.
He's holding the vision.
He is. So he turns to his supervisor, a guy named Jonathan, and proudly announces his vision. I am going to be a motivational speaker. I am going to write a book.
And Jonathan's response is a masterclass in social homeostasis.
Meaning he wants to keep things exactly as they are.
Yes. He doesn't just doubt the speaker, he actively attempts to crush him. He mocks the speaker's thick Haitian accent. He questions his marketability, asking who in corporate America is going to pay you.
Just tearing him down.
And crucially, he attacks the speaker's authority to even hold the dream, asking, do you have any credentials? Do you have a PhD?
It is a brutal, humiliating dressing down from someone in a position of authority. The speaker writes in the manuscript that he could physically feel his new story shrinking inside his chest.
Of course.
Jonathan had a uniform, a name tag, and power. Jonathan was demanding evidence. Think of Jonathan's like an immune system response in the human body.
Ah, that's an interesting analogy.
The immune system's only job is to attack anything new and unfamiliar to maintain the body's baseline temperature. It doesn't care if the new entity is a virus or a life-saving cure.
If it disrupts the known environment, it attacks.
Exactly.
That is a perfect analogy for social dynamics. Sociologists often refer to this as the crab in a bucket mentality.
Crabs in a bucket.
Yeah, if you put one crab in a bucket, it can easily climb out. But if you put multiple crabs in a bucket, the moment one tries to escape, the others will reach up and pull it back down.
Because they don't want to be left behind.
Right. Jonathan is terrified of your new story because your elevation implicitly highlights their stagnation.
Oh, wow.
If the immigrant doorman with an accent can write a book and speak on stages, what is Jonathan's excuse for being stuck as a bitter supervisor?
He has no excuse.
Exactly. Jonathan's demand formal credentials because credentials are the gatekeeping mechanisms that protect the status quo.
Jonathans are everywhere. I mean, ask yourself right now, who is the Jonathan in your life?
Everyone has one.
Is it a passive-aggressive sibling who always brings up your past failures when you try to change? Is it a manager who shoots down every innovative idea because that's not how we do things here?
Or, terrifyingly, is the ultimate Jonathan living right between your own ears.
Oh, the internal Jonathan.
Yeah, that voice that says, who do you think you are to apply for that job? You don't have the right degree.
The internal Jonathan is always the most lethal because it knows exactly where your insecurities are buried.
It has the map.
It really does.
Mm.
The speaker's response to the external Jonathan, however, provides a blueprint for how to handle both. He doesn't argue with Jonathan's facts. He doesn't try to prove his English is perfect.
What does he do?
He reappropriates the attack. He remembers Tati-Da. He pulls his shoulders back, looks Jonathan in the eye and says, buddy, I do have a PhD. My P stands for persistence. My H stands for hope. My D stands for dream. And one day, I might autograph my book to you.
That is incredible. It is an act of profound psychological defiance. He invents his own internal credential to override the external demand for validation.
He makes up his own PhD.
He essentially tells Jonathan, your metrics for success do not apply to my narrative.
He tells the audience that they have to guard their news story like a candle in the wind, especially at the beginning when the flame is weak.
You have to protect it.
For these Head Start teachers, their classrooms might be the absolute only place a child's candle is protected from the wind, because at 3 bar p.m., that child might go back to a house full of Jonathans.
Stressed parents, cynical siblings.
A neighborhood that predicts their failure. The educator has to cup their hands around that flame until the child's own hands are big enough to protect it themselves.
But this raises an important question, one that is highly relevant to the burnout crisis in education and the corporate world alike.
Which is?
Protecting someone else's candle is exhausting labor. Constantly fending off Jonathans, navigating systemic roadblocks, and maintaining a vision of hope, it requires massive amounts of energy.
It's totally draining.
So how does an individual sustain that posture over years or decades without completely depleting themselves?
The speaker addresses this exact vulnerability in the next major framework of the speech. He knows he can't just tell them to work harder at being hopeful.
Right, that goes back to the toxic positivity trap.
Exactly. So he introduces the concept of posture and endurance through another memory from his childhood. He paints this vivid, cinematic picture of a man in the village named Raphael.
Okay, tell me about Raphael.
The young speaker, maybe 7 years old, is carrying heavy buckets of drinking water down a dusty path. He spots Raphael sitting on a large white rock.
Just sitting there.
Yeah. Raphael has his machete leaning against his shoulder, a straw hat pulled low against the blazing sun, and sweat glistening on his skin. But Raphael isn't working. He is completely still, intensely watching the bees moving among the plants.
Just watching the bee.
Just watching. The boy stops, sets his heavy buckets down, and asks Raphael why the bees fly back and forth all day. Are they lost? Are they tired?
What a great question from a kid.
And Raphael uses the moment to hand the boy a philosophical framework that clearly shaped the rest of his life. He explains the fundamental nature of the bee.
Which is?
A bee's entire existence is predicated on seeking sweetness. They fly past thorns, dirt, and dead leaves to find the nectar. They extract the sweet, they make honey, and they work in the light.
But then Raphael introduces the counter-entity, right? The rattlesnake.
But rattlesnake.
He explains that rattlesnakes are also busy, but their nature is entirely different. They slither through the underbrush looking for bitter leaves.
Yeah, the sweet nectar.
No, the bitter leaves. They consume the bitterness, they synthesize it into poison, and they use that poison to strike.
Yeah.
And crucially, they prefer to do their work in the dark.
The metaphor is so stark. Raphael looks at the boy and delivers the thesis. Every single person you meet in this life is operating as either a bee or a rattlesnake.
Wow.
But the real danger, the real warning the speaker gives to the teachers is the mechanism of how you become one or the other. Raphael says, whichever one you look for, that is the one you become.
The neuroscience of this is undeniable.
Here we go back to the brain.
It goes right back to the reticular activating system we talked about earlier. If you orient your attention toward bitterness, your brain becomes a highly efficient machine for finding and processing bitterness.
You train yourself to find the poison.
Exactly. The speaker warns the audience about the insidious, creeping nature of becoming a rattlesnake. It rarely happens through one catastrophic event.
It's slow.
It is a slow accumulation of tiny concessions to negativity.
And he maps it out perfectly for their work environment. He says it starts with one complaint in the hallway about federal paperwork, and you nod in agreement.
Right, just a nod.
Then it's a frustrated text thread about a difficult parent. You chime in. Then it's a staff meeting where everyone collectively sighs about the problem kid in room 3. You absorb that energy.
It builds up.
And suddenly, without realizing it, you are walking into your classroom not looking for the breakthrough, but looking for the annoyance. You are seeking the bitter leaves.
There's a powerful neurochemical lure to complaining.
There is.
Oh, absolutely. When we engage in shared grievances with coworkers, when we act as rattlesnakes together, our brains release dopamine.
Wait, really? Complaining gives us dopamine.
Yes, it creates a form of trauma bonding. It feels good in the short term to validate each other's misery because it relieves us of the responsibility to change it.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
But the long-term cost is catastrophic.
Yeah.
The speaker notes, the child can feel it. Emotional contagion is real.
They pick up on it.
If the adult in the room is vibrating with the poison of burnout and resentment, the children absorb that frequency instantly.
But let me ask the question that I know every exhausted listener is screaming at their speakers right now.
Let's hear it.
Isn't it profoundly exhausting to force yourself to be a bee? If you are working in an underfunded school or dealing with an abusive boss or navigating a crushing medical diagnosis, the bitter leaves are an illusion. They are everywhere.
They are very real.
Seeking sweetness in a toxic environment sounds like a recipe for deep psychological dissonance. It sounds like telling people to just smile while the ship sinks.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the keynote, we see that the speaker actively anticipates this exact objection.
He knows they're going to feel that way.
He does. He doesn't offer the bee analogy as a mandate for toxic positivity. He demonstrates the application through a physical exercise with the audience.
The smile race.
The smile race. He interrupts the heavy narrative and initiates this. He forces this room of hundreds of tired adults to stand up, physically turn in every direction, and aggressively smile and laugh at the people around them.
At first, it probably feels incredibly cheesy to them. Like, what are we doing?
Oh, I'm sure it felt ridiculous. But the metadata notes reveal the underlying strategy. Once the physical energy in the room has shifted, once the tension is broken by the absurdity of the exercise, he delivers a massive reframe.
He flips the script.
He tells them, a smile is not a small thing. A smile is your first weapon against the rattlesnakes.
A weapon. Not a white flag of surrender to the circumstances, but a weapon.
Exactly. He clarifies that being a bee is not about ignoring the sinking ship. Being a bee is a rigid, defiant boundary.
You are protecting your energy.
When you choose to smile, when you choose to seek the honey in a chaotic environment, you are asserting total sovereignty over your internal state.
You're taking back control.
You are telling the environment, you can be underfunded, you can be unfair, you can be aggressively difficult, but you do not dictate my emotional response.
Wow.
He says, I am not a thermometer reacting to the temperature of the room. I am a thermostat setting it.
Seeking the sweetness is an act of self-preservation. It keeps the poison out of your own bloodstream.
Yeah, that's the key.
He gives them a final command in this section. Let them see a bee. Let the children see an adult who refuses to be poisoned by the world so they know that safety is possible.
It is a stunning mandate.
It really is. And it perfectly sets the stage for the climax of the speech, what we are calling Part 6. Turkeys, eagles, and pointing at the sky.
The speaker is hyper-aware of cognitive load here.
Because they've been through a lot in this hour.
A lot. He has walked this audience through heavy trauma, challenged their internal narratives, demanded they confront their own burnout, and tasked them with protecting the fragile beliefs of children.
That is a massive mental workout.
To synthesize all of this without overwhelming them, he shifts into the oldest form of human communication, a parable.
It's a classic story, but he injects it with such specific intent. He tells the story of a farmer who finds an abandoned eagle egg and places it into a turkey nest.
Okay, so it hatches with the turkeys.
Right. The egg hatches, and the baby eagle grows up surrounded entirely by turkeys. What does the developing brain do with consensus? It adapts.
Like we talked about at the beginning.
Exactly. The eagle learns to peck at the dirt, eat turkey food, and walk with its head down, staring at the ground.
The eagle has the physical anatomy of an apex predator of the sky, but its operating system is entirely ground-based.
The condition is eagle, the story is turkey.
Spot on.
Then one day, a magnificent, fully grown eagle flies overhead, soaring on the thermals. The eagle on the ground looks up, feels a strange stirring in its chest, and says, "Wow, I wish I could do that."
And what did the turkey say?
The turkey standing next to him, the ultimate Jonathan, laughs and says, "Don't be stupid. You're a turkey. Turkeys don't fly."
And the speaker writes a note in the margins here. Hold the pause. Let the tragedy land.
Let it land. The eagle accepts the Jonathan's verdict. He lowers his head, lives his entire life pecking at the dirt, and dies believing he was a turkey.
It's a tragedy.
The punchline is brutal. He didn't die on the ground because he lacked wings. He died on the ground because nobody ever told him he was an eagle.
The narrative always defeats the physical reality unless someone intervenes.
Always. The speaker turns the full emotional weight of this parable directly onto the teachers. He looks at them and says, "The children walking through your doors from poverty, from broken homes, from trauma.
The entire world is telling them they are turkeys.
The world is handing them Cocoa Bay name tags. But they are eagles. And you, the teacher, the educator, you are the eagle with vision. Your entire purpose is to point at the sky and tell them where they belong."
And then, with absolute narrative mastery, he closes the loop. He brings the 60-minute journey full circle back to the dirt floor.
I get chills every time I review this section. He drops his voice and says to the room, "That was my story. I was an eagle in a village full of people telling me I was a turkey. They called me Cocoa Bay."
And then he brings back the hero of the entire framework.
Tatida.
He reminds them of the old woman in the shack. Tatida was the eagle who pointed at the sky for a starving boy in Port-au-Prince.
It is an exquisite structural payoff.
It really is. He took the audience on a journey where they initially felt pity for a starving victim. Then, he taught them the cognitive mechanics of how the victim escaped the trap through Tatida's intervention.
He gave them the tools.
But the ultimate resolution of the speech isn't just about celebrating the speaker's survival. The resolution is an identity shift for the listener.
He changes who they are in the room.
He looks at this room of exhausted bureaucrats and transforms them into heroes. He tells them, "You are not just managing classrooms. You are Tatida. You are the architects of the future."
So what does this all mean for you and me? For the person listening to this deep dive right now in traffic or sitting at their desk?
It's deeply personal.
The most profound realization here is that breaking your own false stories isn't just an act of self-improvement. It is a prerequisite for leadership.
You have to do the work yourself first.
You earn the vision required to break the lies for others by doing the grueling work of breaking them in yourself.
You cannot transmit a frequency that you are not actively emitting.
That's powerful.
If you're walking around with your head down, rehearsing a narrative of defeat, you cannot authentically point anyone else toward the sky. The speaker explicitly notes this in his final guide. You must isolate your own fiction before you can correct someone else's.
Which brings us to our final synthesis of this incredible manuscript. We've journeyed from a forgotten village where the brain accepts the deadly consensus of Cocoa Bay, confusing a temporary condition with a permanent identity.
We saw the trap of the geographic cure, proving that you can change your zip code, but you can't outrun your inner monologue.
We examined the profound cognitive reframing of Tatida, who separated circumstance from identity and asked the ultimate storybreaker question.
Is this true, or is it a fictional conclusion?
We broke down the neuroscience of Hebb's law and the reticular activating system, proving that rehearsing a lie literally wires the brain to relive it.
We saw the courage required to hold the vision before demanding the AT&T check.
We learned how to defend that fragile new vision from the Jonathans, recognizing their demands for credentials as merely the immune response of a stagnant status quo.
We explored the defiant, boundary-setting posture of the bee versus the toxic, dopamine-driven complaining of the rattlesnake.
And finally, we realized the ultimate responsibility of seeing the eagles trapped in turkey nests.
The foundational mantra of this entire framework is absolute. No condition is permanent. Change the story, and you change everything.
So here is your call to action today. Sometime in the next few hours, take the speaker's first storybreaker question and apply it to the most stubborn area of your life.
Identify the negative script you are rehearsing right now.
Look at it objectively and ask, is this an indisputable physical fact, or is it a fictional conclusion I have allowed my brain to draw from a temporary struggle?
The moment you label the conclusion as fiction, you sever its neurological power to author your future.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over today. If the story you tell yourself actively creates your reality by filtering your opportunities and directing your actions, what happens when you decide to intentionally write a story that feels completely, utterly impossible right now?
What if the only gap between fiction and the future is simply your courage to rehearse the impossible out loud?
Whose sky can you point to today before you have a single shred of proof that they can fly?